Hey everyone, welcome to the demo for secure self-service provisioning of EKS clusters using ACK, Argo CD, and Kyverno. So first, let's look at the setup. On my management cluster, I have ACK, Argo CD, and Kyverno running. With ACK, I have the EKS controller already deployed along with the corresponding CIDs. Argo CD pods are up and running, and I have predefined 3 app sets. These app sets will be deployed on every cluster that is created. I also have Kyverno deployed, and I have some policies already deployed for Kyverno. Out of these policies, the generate application policy, the generate kubeconfig policy, and the register cluster policy will provide the necessary automation to provision my clusters. Now let's look at the rest of the setup. I have the Nirmata policy manager already set up. This is where my cluster will register once it's provisioned. I have Argo CD set up. This is where my application and app sets will be displayed and it will trigger the provisioning process. And I have my AWS account. This is where we should see the cluster getting created. In addition, we have created a custom resource definition that will be used to create the cluster. This custom resource definition called create cluster can be used to specify the configuration of the cluster, and you can allow any configuration that you want the developers to change in your CRD. So in this case, we are going to let the developer specify the cluster name and the size of the cluster. So let's go ahead and trigger the creation of the cluster. I'm going to use a namespace called Team A for this cluster. So once the creation is triggered, we should see the cluster object being created in the Team A namespace. Now this object or this resource is the Kubernetes EKS ACK resource. We can also see the cluster creation triggered in Argo CD. So if you look at the ACK demo cluster app, you can see all of the different resources for creating the cluster are being deployed. Going back to the command line, we can take a look at some of the other resources as well. This is the node group resource, and we also have some default add-ons that will be deployed along with the cluster. Now let's check on the AWS console if this cluster creation has started. As you can see, the cluster creation has started, and it could take anywhere between 10 to 15 minutes to create the cluster. We can monitor the progress of the cluster by specifying the cluster name and looking at the status of the cluster. As you can see, the cluster is in the creating state, and in a few minutes, the cluster should go into active state. Okay. Let's look at the policies that we have deployed. So the first policy over here watches for creation of the create cluster resource, and then it actually creates an Argo CD application from my demo repository and passes in the necessary values to the Helm chart. The values can be seen over here. It includes the cluster name, the default role ARNs, as well as the subnet and the desired size. The cluster name and the desired size are being picked up from the request that is being submitted by the developer. The other policy we have here is to register the cluster. So in Argo CD, you can register a cluster by creating a secret in the Argo CD namespace. So this is a generate policy that creates a secret. In order to create a secret, we need some information from the cluster, like the certificate authority data, as well as the owner account ID and the endpoint for the cluster. So all of this information is retrieved from the cluster object, and then the secret is created. Once the secret is created, Argo CD can actually communicate with the newly created cluster. We also have another policy which creates a kubeconfig file for the developer to access the cluster. So as you can see, this is a kubeconfig file that will be created, and it will be added as a secret in the same namespace that the developer has access to. In this case, we created the cluster in the tmain namespace. So this secret will be created in that namespace so that the developer can use it to access the cluster. As you can see, the newly created cluster is in active state. The certificate authority data is now available, as well as the endpoint. In Argo CD, you can see some additional applications being created on this new cluster based on the app sets that we created. If you go to the clusters panel, you should see that the new cluster has already been registered. This was done by the generate policy that we had installed on the cluster. On the EKS console, you can see that the cluster is being created and the node groups also have been created. Now, if you go to the Nirmata policy in manager, you can see that our newly created cluster has already been deployed, and you can see this cluster has policies already deployed. Quickly, you should be able to see the policy reports for this cluster and check on any policy violations for this cluster as well. So this is a demo of how an EKS cluster can be provisioned using ACK, Argo CD, and Kyverno. Thank you.